What if everything we think we know about the North Pole is wrong, not just slightly off, not just early explorers were confused, completely, fundamentally, impossibly wrong? Picture this. You're standing in a dimly lit archive. The air smells like dust and linen. A curator in white gloves rolls out a massive sheet of old paper, yellowed, cracked at the edges, ink faded but still sharp where it matters. It's a map of the Arctic from the 16th century, but it's not ice. It's not a blank white cap. It's not the empty frozen ocean we are told is up there. Instead, you see four vast landmasses arranged like petals around the very top of the world. Between them, four powerful seas converge on a circular void at the exact center. And right there, at the pole, where we imagine only drifting ice, stands a colossal black mountain. A name is written beside it, in cold, matter-of-fact Latin. Rups Nigra, the Black Rock. You're not looking at a fantasy illustration in the margin of a manuscript. You're looking at what was once presented as the best available geography of the Arctic. Practical, nautical, serious. And here's where the unease begins. Because when we search through surviving cartographic collections, the kind of rare archives preserved by antique map dealers and libraries, we don't just find one oddball drawing. We find this same configuration again and again. Four lands encircling a polar sea, a central whirlpool, a massive magnetic black rock rising as high as the clouds. Dutch cartographer Cornelis de Jode shows it in 1593. Petrus Plancius, one of the founding minds behind the Dutch East India Company, repeats the pattern in 1594. Abraham Ortelius, in his 1570 world map, the cornerstone of what's often called the first modern atlas, includes it as a given. Different hands, different nations, different agendas. Same impossible Arctic. Official history insists this is nothing more than a collection of old mistakes, a myth, a misunderstanding, a relic of pre-scientific geography. We are told they simply didn't know what was really there. But if they didn't know, why do so many of them draw the same thing? Why four islands? Why a central sea? Why a black magnetic rock so specific it has a name, a size, and a function? Why does the error look so precise? We're supposed to believe that generations of cartographers, scholars, and navigators all just made it up and happened to agree on the same false details for over a century. Is that ignorance? Or is that memory? To answer that, we have to go further back, beyond the Age of Discovery, beyond the Renaissance, beyond even Rome, into a realm where the North was never just cold. It was sacred. The ancients had a word for this far northern land, Hyperborea, beyond the north wind. Already the name feels like a clue. The north wind, Boreas, marks the limit of the known world. Hyperborea is what lies beyond that limit, beyond the storms, beyond the familiar sky, a place that exists, but not for us. Ancient Greek writers did not fully agree on where Hyperborea was. They gave fragments, hints, contradictions. But one detail stands out like a flare in the dark. The claim that there, the sun rises and sets only once per year. Let's pause on that. A sun that rises once and sets once across a whole year. We don't have to guess what that means. We know, mathematically and astronomically, that there is only one region on Earth where this can happen, within the Arctic Circle. So already, in these texts thousands of years old, the North is more than a blank. It is a region with specific astronomical behavior. Whoever described Hyperborea knew something about polar light and darkness. We are told this is a coincidence. That poetic exaggeration happened to mimic modern polar science. But mathematics does not bend for poetry. Either the ancients had knowledge of polar conditions, or we are watching a repeating hallucination that somehow aligns perfectly with the physics of our planet. That's the first crack. The second crack comes from the climate. Hyperborea, according to these same traditions, was not a frozen wasteland. It was described as temperate, even mild. Crops grew abundantly. The land was fertile. The people lived in harmony with their environment, touched by a god the Greeks associated with light, order, and music, Apollo. So now we have a paradox, a land far north, far enough for the sun to rise once a year, yet mild, comfortable, and richly habitable. Under our current model, that should not exist. The further north you go, the harsher the environment becomes. Ice sheets, permafrost, frozen seas. This is the core of our climatic understanding. So which is wrong? The ancients or the climate? We dismiss the ancients. We say, they were talking in metaphors. They were ignorant. They were mythologizing. But if they were mythologizing, why are their myths anchored to correctly described polar light cycles? Why is one part accurate while another is impossible? This is not a random fable. This is a puzzle. The inhabitants of Hyperborea were said to be extraordinary, people who could live for 1,000 years, people sometimes described as towering, gigantic, 10 feet tall, a civilization untouched by war, disease, or decay as we know it, so powerful, according to some accounts, that an invading force of 10 million men once attempted to conquer them and failed. 10 million. Let's do something official history rarely does with these numbers. Let's treat them as if they mattered. 10 million would be more than 5 times the number of soldiers that landed in Normandy in the first 3 days of the D-Day invasion, widely considered the largest seaborne landing in history. Even if the ancient figure is exaggerated, the scale of the claim is staggering. We're expected to believe that such a story is pure fiction, that a civilian historian or chronicler simply pulled 10 million from thin air, with no reference, no grounding, no proportional understanding. But ancient societies were obsessed with ratios, with comparisons, with meaningful numbers. They used them symbolically, yes, but not randomly. What are the odds that such a persistent account of a northern land with unusual sunlight, unusual climate, unusual people survived for centuries, only to be nothing more than meaningless noise? One story might be coincidence. But when we move forward 2,000 years and discover that professional cartographers are now drawing a strange and detailed landscape at the North Pole, a landscape that doesn't match our current reality but does match the idea of a habitable northern realm, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. A land to the far north, a region shaped by unusual cosmic cycles, inhabitants who do not fit our concept of normal humanity, an environment that should not exist, yet is described in intricate, repeating forms. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. And then in the 16th century, a name appears, a name you already know, even if you don't realize it yet, that quietly cements this pattern onto the very foundations of our modern map of the world, Gerardus Mercator. We are taught to know Mercator for one reason, his projection. The rectangular world map that makes Greenland look almost as big as Africa. The grid that today underlies countless schoolroom maps, wall charts, and even the digital navigation tools on your phone. But there's something you were not told. Mercator did not just create a convenient projection, he drew a North Pole you have never seen. On his great world map, the Arctic region is awkward, distorted, an afterthought at the top, but he also produced a more focused depiction, an inset of the northern realms, and later, a fully dedicated map of the Arctic region itself, the first known standalone map of the far north. In that Arctic map, the center of our planet is not a blank expanse of ice. It is the same configuration we saw before. 4 large landmasses separated by 4 inward-flowing seas converging on a central void. At the very heart of that void, a towering black mountain of magnetic stone, Rupes Nigra. We are told that these were just theories, educated guesses, artistic license, that Mercator and his contemporaries filled the unknown with imaginative speculation. Really, let's unpack that. These maps were not merely decorative, they were tools. In the 16th century, trade between Europe and the East Indies was exploding. Ships were traveling vast distances circling the southern tip of Africa on journeys that could take 2 years if they survived. Every extra month at sea meant more risk, storms, war, shipwreck, disease, scurvy. 1 in 5 ships of the Dutch East India Company never came back. 1 in 3 employees died. Imagine the economic pressure, the desperation to find safer, faster routes. Now imagine staring at the top of a world map and seeing, tantalizingly, a possible shortcut, a northeast passage, a sea route over the top of the world, connecting Europe to the East Indies in just 6 months instead of 2 years. Would you, in that position, rely on pure fantasy? Would merchants, investors, statesmen, and navigators build plans and risk lives based on someone's decorative guess about the geography of the Arctic? Or would they demand information, accounts, testimonies, reports from people who claim to have been there? We are told that Mercator simply copied earlier myths, but Mercator himself left clues that this was not how he saw it. On his world map, he wrote that his Arctic geography came from a specific source, the Itinerarium of Jacobus Conoyen of The Hague. Conoyen, in turn, claimed to be summarizing an even older work, Inventio Fortunata, The Discovery of Fortune, said to have been written by a 14th century Franciscan friar and mathematician who claimed to have journeyed to the far north in 1360, allegedly under the patronage of the English king Edward III. Already, the neat narrative starts to shake. We move from "they guessed" to "they copied myths" to "they referenced a travel report" to "that report came from a man who claimed to have gone there." This is not a simple chain of fantasy. It is a trail. But here is where the story turns from curious to deeply unsettling, because the book, Inventio Fortunata, is gone. No one can show it to you. It lies in a shadow between recorded and erased history, known only by references, quotations, and second-hand echoes. We're left in the dark with fragments. A priest at the court of the King of Norway in 1364 who claimed to have met the friar, an exchange of gifts, an astrolabe for a Bible. A mapmaker centuries later citing their story as the basis for his depiction of the Arctic. In other words, the image of the North Pole that quietly haunted European maps for over a century was not invented in an armchair. It was based, at least officially, on a journey we are not allowed to verify, a book that no longer exists, a testimony preserved just long enough to shape our maps, and then vanish. Why? Why would the detailed description of one of the most strategically important regions of the planet be allowed to disappear? Why do we find traces of a coherent northern world, Hyperborea in the distant past, Rupes Nigra on Renaissance maps, only to have every primary source documenting it either lost, destroyed, or dismissed as fantasy? At what point does coincidence stop being a rational explanation and start becoming a cover story? Mercator tried to explain where his information came from. He even wrote, years later, to an English astronomer named John Dee describing the Arctic in chilling detail. But that letter raises even more disturbing questions. Because if we take Mercator at his word, then at the top of our planet once existed something far stranger and far more structured than a random patch of ice. And that structure might still be hiding in plain sight, beneath centuries of rewritten history and redrawn maps. Imagine Mercator at his desk. Not the polished portrait we see in textbooks, the wise old mapmaker with instruments neatly arranged, but a tired man hunched over candlelight, quill in hand, surrounded by letters, fragmentary reports, and strange testimonies no one knows what to do with. In 1577, he writes to John Dee, an English astronomer and advisor to the throne. The topic, the Arctic. He does not say, "I guessed." He does not say, "I filled in the blank." Instead, he describes something concrete, geometric, measured. He speaks of 4 indrawing seas that divide the lands of the north, all rushing toward a central whirlpool, as if the ocean itself is being pulled into the earth like water through a funnel. He says this central maelstrom is 4 degrees wide on each side of the pole, 8 degrees total. Stop there. Degrees of latitude are not poetic metaphors. They are units, quantities. 1 degree of latitude is roughly 111 kilometers, or about 69 miles. 8 degrees? That's nearly 900 kilometers, over 500 miles, of swirling ocean centered on the top of the world. Is this how you speak when you are inventing a myth? Or is this how you speak when you are recording someone's measurements? Mercator then writes that at the very center of this polar whirlpool stands a bare rock, a mountain, almost 33 French miles in circumference, made of magnetic stone, rising to the clouds. Nothing grows on it, he says, not a handful of soil. Its surface is black, glistening, exposed. 33 French miles. Again, not fantasy language, a specific unit, a specific number. We are told this is still myth. That a friar in the 14th century simply embroidered a northern fairy tale with fake precision, and Mercator, for reasons unknown, decided to treat it as reliable. But think about how improbable that is. If you are writing fiction, why tether your made-up world to navigational coordinates and carefully express distances, knowing that sailors and scholars could challenge those values? Why risk your reputation on a measurable lie? If instead you believe you are reporting a real observation, a real journey, you anchor it in numbers so others can find it. Mathematics does not lie. Someone believed this black rock existed. Someone believed it could be measured. Someone believed it was so central to the behavior of compasses that it explained why the needle points north. You could dismiss one detail. You could ignore one map. But the deeper we go, the more the pattern tightens. Because Mercator is not the only one who heard this story. A century before his Arctic map, another cartographer, Johannes Reusch, included references to Inventio Fortunata on his 1507 world map. He too had heard of the mysterious northern journey. He too treated it as a source. So we have an unknown friar and mathematician in the 14th century claiming to explore the far north on a royal commission, a priest at the Norwegian court who says he met him and trades an astrolabe for a Bible, a lost travelogue, Inventio Fortunata, a summary of that lost book, the itinerarium of Jacobus Knoyen, then multiple mapmakers, Reusch, Mercator, and others, drawing the same incredible configuration at the top of the world. This is not one man's fantasy. This is a chain of transmission. And yet, the book at the center of that chain is gone. We are told this is normal, that medieval texts vanish all the time, that it is trivial, unremarkable, that the one document giving a detailed description of the North Pole just happens to have disappeared without a trace. But what if it didn't just vanish? What if it was removed? What if a consistent early tradition about the Arctic was quietly replaced with a different story? Look at how carefully the gaps are arranged. We have enough fragments to know that Inventio Fortunata existed, enough to know that its author claimed to have gone north, enough to know that he described a polar whirlpool, a magnetic mountain, and even strange inhabitants, pygmies, small people of the remote north. But we do not have the text itself. We don't know what else it said. We don't know what was cut out. We can only see the outline of something that used to sit at the center of our understanding of the planet. And that outline matches something even older, because centuries before this friar supposedly made his way to the Arctic, another writer described a monstrous sea current in the far north, a place where all waters converge and vanish. Gerald of Wales, writing in the late 12th or early 13th century, spoke of a terrifying gulf in the ocean towards the north. He said the waves from all directions rush toward it, drawn by some hidden conduit, devoured by the abyss, swallowing any ship that dares to approach. This is not a casual image. It is the same idea. A convergence of waters, a central void, a deadly pull, ancient Hyperborea, medieval gulf, Renaissance whirlpool, early modern magnetic rock, different eras, different languages, the same core motif. We are told this repeating picture is just a shared metaphor, a cultural echo, a mythological inheritance that cartographers naively elevated into geography. But how long are we allowed to hide behind that excuse? At what point does myth become a record we don't want to accept? Now step back and notice something else. The polar whirlpool is not just about drama. It explains something. Early navigators were fascinated and confused by the behavior of the compass. It always pointed roughly north, but not exactly to the geographic pole. They noticed variation, deviation, anomalies. If there were a massive magnetic formation at the top of the world, a mountain of magnetic stone, it would provide a simple, unified answer, a single dominant attractor. Mercator knew about compass variation. He knew that the actual magnetic north did not perfectly coincide with the geographic pole. So what did he do? He didn't discard the rock. He doubled down. We are told that he tried to reconcile the discrepancy by introducing a second magnetic rock elsewhere, an adjustment, a patch, an attempt to rationalize conflicting reports. On the surface, this is presented as evidence of his confusion, but look more closely at the logic. If you invent a magnetic mountain out of sheer imagination, and you later discover that the magnetic pole doesn't align with it, you erase the mountain. You don't cling to it. You don't distort your new data to preserve your old fantasy. You throw the fantasy away. Mercator didn't. He kept trying to fit the new measurements around the older model, around the idea of a structured, active, central region. Why? Because for him, and for the sources he trusted, the black rock was not a decorative flourish. It was an anchor. Now consider the official narrative we're given about what happened next. We're told that by the 1630s, this whole depiction of the Arctic, 4 lands, Central Sea, Rups Nigra, vanishes from maps simply because of real discoveries and improved knowledge. Ships, we're told, sailed further north. Explorers charted coastlines. Slowly, the fantasy was replaced by reality. The polar lands dissolved into ice and open water. The black rock turned out not to be there. Story over. But is it that simple? Ask yourself, how many of these early explorers actually reached the geographic pole? How many stood at 90 degrees and surveyed the surroundings? For centuries, expeditions were blocked by ice, storms, and brutal conditions. They turned back, disappeared, or only glimpsed segments of a complex, shifting region. Coastlines were charted, islands were sketched, but the exact center remained out of reach. So how precisely did we prove that nothing was there? How did we disprove the existence of a central land formation before we ever truly set foot on the spot it was supposed to occupy? We are leaning on an assumption that because some later voyages did not report a black mountain, the earlier reports must be false. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially in a region deliberately avoided, militarized, and restricted in modern times. And there's something else. Cartographers of this era had no problem erasing entire continents when they became inconvenient. Think of Terra Australis, the vast hypothetical southern landmass that once sprawled across maps as a counterweight to the northern continents. For centuries, it haunted the bottom of the page, a placeholder for unknown lands. Then, as explorers traced the coasts of Australia, New Zealand, and Antarctica, Terra Australis evaporated from our charts. It was quietly removed, dismissed as a cartographic fantasy. But what if some of these fantasies were not pure invention? What if they were echoes, distorted memories of a different planetary configuration, a different climatic regime, or a different phase of our world? Official history insists that the disappearance of the 4 Arctic islands and the Black Rock is exactly the same kind of correction, a scientific cleanup of old mistakes. But the circumstances are different. Terra Australis was conjectured to balance the continents. Its shape changed wildly from map to map. It was a blank, a placeholder. The polar lands we're studying are not shapeless guesses. They are structured, named, measured. They appear across multiple independent sources with striking consistency. 4 islands, 4 seas, central whirlpool, magnetic mountain of known circumference. This is not how a wild hypothesis behaves. This is how a memory behaves, fading, fragmented, but stubborn. And then, in the 17th century, it is as if a silent order goes out. Erase it. Stop drawing this. Replace the old polar image with ice. Redact the Black Rock. We're told this is natural progress, that better data simply swept away error. But think about the timing. The 16th and 17th centuries were not just an age of discovery. They were an age of empire. Whoever controlled the seas controlled trade. Whoever controlled the routes controlled power. If there were, at any point, a usable northern passage shaped by unusual geography, a central current, a navigable ring of islands, a magnetic hub, it would be the ultimate strategic secret. Would you advertise that on maps? Or would you let it appear briefly, then bury it? Today, we see the fossil of that earlier vision only in antique map collections and specialist archives. A small group of curators and dealers preserve these sheets of paper that still, stubbornly, show a different world at the top of ours. They are treated as curiosities, artifacts of how wrong we once were. But what if they are something else? What if they are, quite literally, evidence that the map of our reality has been overwritten? And if a region as symbolically and physically central as the North Pole can be rewritten, what else has been reset? Centuries after Mercator put ink to paper, his world-famous projection would become a classroom cliché, but his most unsettling work would remain out of sight, buried in specialist collections and private archives. That work was not the flattened rectangle of the whole world. It was a circle, an Arctic circle, published in 1595, a year after Mercator's death, by his son Romuald. This dedicated map of the North was the first of its kind, a standalone chart of the Arctic. It was not a sketch in the margin. It was not a decorative inset. It was a deliberate attempt to define the very top of the world. On that sheet, the 4 lands encircling the pole are not vague. They have coasts, rivers, mountain chains. The 4 inward seas curve and funnel toward the center, and right at 90 degrees north, looming over the waters, sits Rups Nigra, the Black Rock, calmly labeled, as if its existence were beyond debate. But here's what official history glosses over. This map appeared at a time when the Arctic was not an academic curiosity. It was a potential shortcut that could rearrange the global balance of power. For European powers in the 16th century, the known route to the East Indies was a brutal marathon, down the coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, across dangerous tropical waters, and then finally eastward towards spice-rich lands. The journey could take 2 years or more. 2 years at sea, 2 years of storms shredding sails, salt-eating wood, pirates and rival navies stalking the trade routes, tropical fevers rotting the crew from the inside, and then there was scurvy, the mysterious wasting disease that turned gums black, teeth loose, and muscles into useless knots. On some voyages, entire crews collapsed into living corpses long before they reached their destination. 1 in 5 ships of the Dutch East India Company never returned. 1 in 3 employees died. Now look at those numbers not as statistics in a textbook, but as an economic equation. If every 5 ships you send out, 1 is lost forever, and every 3 men you hire, 1 never comes back. How sustainable is your empire? How long before your investors panic, your rivals circle? Your monarchy questions whether your trade venture is worth the cost. Then imagine hearing whispers of a different route, not south, but north, not 2 years, but 6 months. A northeast passage arching over the top of the world along a ring of islands and seas. A cold route, yes, but one that avoids tropical storms, hostile fleets, and the worst scurvy breeding grounds. A route that, correctly exploited, could slash travel time and risk to a fraction of what you currently endure. Do you see what that means? The Arctic is not a blank white cap anymore. It is a prize. Now ask yourself, in that context, why would the world's leading cartographers base their map of that region on mere fantasy? These were men whose reputations and livelihoods depended on credibility. Their clients were merchants, navigators, statesmen, not poets. If the Arctic map was meant to attract serious investment and guide potential expeditions, it couldn't simply be artistic speculation. The stakes were too high. We are told to believe that Mercator and his contemporaries cheerfully filled the unexplored north with imaginary lands, invented whirlpools, and a non-existent magnetic mountain, and that everyone from ship captains to royal advisors nodded and said, "Sure, sounds good." But when we follow the money, that explanation collapses. A 2-year route versus a 6-month route is not a matter of aesthetics. It is the difference between a fragile trading empire and a dominant one. If any credible report of a usable Arctic passage existed, it would be treated as strategic gold. Mercator's map was not a daydream. It was a coded prospectus, and the source behind it, Inventio Fortunata, was not an idle fantasy novel. It was presented as a travelogue written by a friar who claimed to have gone there on behalf of a king, carrying the instruments of a mathematician. The problem is not that this story is obviously false. The problem is that we are no longer allowed to test it. The book disappeared, the evidence trail was cut, and in its place we're given a simple, soothing narrative. They didn't know. They guessed. Then we found out they were wrong. Except the "we" in that sentence never truly reached the pole until long after these early maps were gone. For more than 300 years after Mercator, the Arctic was a fog of rumors, failed expeditions, national propaganda, and conflicting claims. The truth is, no one had a clear picture, but somehow, during those same 3 centuries, one thing becomes completely clear. The old polar image must go. By the 1630s, the 4 islands and the Black Rock begin to vanish from mainstream maps. Competing theories take over: shifting islands, floating ice, open polar seas, solid ice caps. The old structured geometric Arctic is erased, replaced with a chaotic void of maybe and unknown. We are told this evolution is purely scientific, but look at the pattern. The early image, coherent, structured, mathematically described, rooted in named sources. The later image, vague, uncertain, covered by a rhetoric of further exploration needed. When science improves, details usually increase. The unknown shrinks, names and measurements multiply. Here, the opposite happens. We lose detail, we lose structure, we lose names. The pole becomes less specific, less concrete, less knowable. Just as empires grow more centralized and more capable of suppressing inconvenient stories. That's not the trajectory of discovery. That's the trajectory of a redaction. And the Arctic isn't the only place where this pattern appears. Across cultures, across millennia, we find recurring symbols of a central axis of the world, a mountain, a pillar, a tree, located at or near the cosmic north. The Greeks spoke of a land beyond Boreas. Hindu tradition places Mount Meru at the center of the world, axis of heaven and earth. Norse cosmology describes Yggdrasil, the world tree connecting realms, with a sacred well beneath. Different names, different images, same idea, a central vertical structure, a place where forces converge, a seat of gods or godlike beings. A region that exists on the edge of normal human access, and often a warning, do not approach lightly. Combine that with the story of the Arctic whirlpool, a literal convergence of oceans, a vertical current pulling water downward, and a disturbing overlap emerges. Are we looking at separate, independent myths, or scattered fragments of a once unified memory? We are told again that this is coincidence, that cultures invent similar images because humans share archetypal patterns in the mind, that the central mountain, the world tree, the axis mundi are just expressions of our psychological need for order. But let's do what official history almost never does. Let's put numbers on the coincidence. How many independent traditions describe a far northern region beyond normal winds and seasons, unusual celestial behavior like a yearly sunrise and sunset, a central structure, mountain, pillar, or tree, linking worlds or directing forces, a place of long-lived, superior, or godlike beings, a surrounding boundary, ocean, mountains, or storms that makes it hard to reach? Once? That's myth. Twice? That's curious. Dozens of times in different forms, across ages and continents. That's a pattern. And patterns, when they align with physical possibilities, like actual polar light cycles, are not easily dismissed. Meanwhile, the one region on our planet that matches these astronomical oddities, the Arctic Circle, is the same region whose historic maps have been rewritten, whose early descriptions have been lost, whose strategic importance has been maximized, and whose true nature you are told not to think about. We've been trained to view the pole as an environmental issue, a geopolitical chessboard, a wilderness of ice. We have not been trained to see it as a scar. What if the Black Rock, the whirlpool, and the four islands are not wrong geography, but fossilized references to an earlier state of our world? Imagine for a moment a different Earth, an Earth where the climate is not arranged as it is now, where axial tilt, orbital parameters, or even the distribution of land and sea allowed a temperate, habitable ring around the top of the planet, a region of long days and short nights, of extended harvests, where a civilization could flourish with knowledge of the stars unmatched by equatorial cultures, a civilization with time, with stable conditions, with centuries upon centuries to refine astronomy, navigation, and maybe technologies we no longer have the language to describe. Call it Hyperborea, call it something else. Then imagine a rupture, not a small disaster, not a war, not a plague, a planetary reconfiguration, whether through natural cataclysm or something far stranger, that shifts climates, redistributes oceans, and locks the former northern paradise beneath ice and instability. The survivors scatter. Some move south, carrying scraps of knowledge, memories of the land they came from, encoded as myth to survive in hostile, ignorant surroundings. Over time, the hard scientific details erode into legend, poetry, ritual. The central mountain becomes a world axis. The polar currents become abysses of the sea. The long days become stories of a place where the sun does not behave like it does here. And yet, some fragment of this knowledge survives in more technical circles. A chain of initiates, monks, mathematicians, navigators, people who keep more precise memories hidden in coded texts and selective maps. People who occasionally send one of their own, like a 14th century friar with an astrolabe, northward to confirm what remains. If such a journey took place, what would he have found? Not the living Hyperborea of old tales, not a thriving civilization under mild skies. By the 14th century, the Ice Age remnants and ongoing climatic shifts would have turned the region harsh, unstable, broken. He might have seen shattered coastlines, warm currents threading through cold seas, strange magnetic anomalies, maybe even remnants of a structure, natural or artificial, at the center of swirling waters. Enough to realize that the old stories were not pure fiction, enough to know something enormous had been lost. He returns. He writes Inventio Fortunata, the discovery of fortune, for a king who may see the Arctic as a trade opportunity, not a cosmic wound. The book circulates among a small, educated circle. Cartographers like Ruysch and Mercator read summaries or second-hand accounts. They quietly embed this older reality into their maps. And then, as the age of empires and nation-states tightens its grip, another decision is made. This time, not by a lone friar or a small circle of scholars, but by the machinery of power itself. The Arctic is not to be remembered as a former center. It is to be redrawn as a margin. The magnetic mountain, gone. The four islands, gone. The whirlpool, gone. The ancient northern civilization, reduced to myth. In their place, ice, emptiness, and a narrative of noble explorers slowly filling in a previously blank canvas. What if the canvas was never blank? What if it was scrubbed? Mercator's attempts to reconcile competing magnetic data by adding a second rock instead of removing the first suddenly look less like confusion and more like resistance, like a man trying to hold on to an older model in the face of a newer, enforced one. He dies. His son publishes the Arctic map in 1595. For a few decades, it survives in print. Then the tide turns. New authorities declare it obsolete, and the alternate image of the pole is locked away in private collections and academic margins. You were never meant to see it. You were never meant to lay the Arctic maps beside the ancient myths, beside the medieval Gulf, beside the Lost Friars travelogue, and notice that they all point in the same direction, toward a missing chapter in human history, toward a reset. If this is true, if the top of the world was once the center of something far greater than we've been allowed to imagine, then every official map, every textbook diagram of Earth's past is not just incomplete, it is misleading. And the black rock at the pole, whether a literal formation or a symbol of something deeper, becomes more than a discarded error in old cartography. It becomes a marker, a gravestone at the heart of the planet. The question is, what exactly died there? What if the answer is nothing died there? What if something was buried alive? For nearly 300 years after Mercator's time, the Arctic would be wrapped in a peculiar fog, not of weather, but of words, theories, rumors, and outright lies about the geography of the far north multiplied: open polar seas, solid ice caps, floating islands, invisible continents, warm water oceans hidden behind frozen barriers. Every few decades, a new model appeared, contradicted the last, and then collapsed under its own weight. One explorer insisted there was navigable water at the pole. Another swore there was impenetrable pack ice. One nation trumpeted discovery. Another quietly disproved it. It would be funny if the stakes weren't so high. We're told this chaos is simply what happens when humans explore a dangerous, difficult region. Conflicting reports, uncertain data, misunderstandings, nothing more. But stand back and look at the long arc. Before the 17th century, the Arctic is portrayed in a coherent, structured way. 4 lands, 4 seas, a central whirlpool, a magnetic hub. After the 17th century, the region becomes a battleground of contradictory narratives, none of them stable, all of them vague. Consistency is not replaced by precision. It's replaced by noise. This is exactly what you would expect, if the purpose is not to describe, but to obscure. Flood a subject with enough contradictory information, and the average person will step back and say, no one really knows. The original structured description is drowned, not by one competing truth, but by many half-truths. We watch the same trick play out across history again and again. The South was once dominated by Terra Australis, a hypothetical continent spread like a shadow across the bottom of the world. It came and went on maps, changing shape like smoke, until finally it dissolved into the smaller, acceptable landmasses we now recognize: Australia, Antarctica, scattered islands. The North, by contrast, begins with structure and ends as blankness. It's as if the planet itself has been rotated inside our minds. The place that was once central becomes marginal. The place that was once specific becomes abstract. Why? Follow the logic. If there truly were a former center of civilization at the top of the world, a Hyperborean ring, a cluster of polar lands shaped around a powerful magnetic core, then acknowledging that reality today would force us to rewrite everything: our timelines, our population models, our assumptions about where civilization began and how it spread. We are told that advanced, organized societies emerged in a narrow window, A few thousand years around the Fertile Crescent, the Nile, the Indus, the Yellow River. Before that, scattered hunter-gatherers. Nothing global, nothing coordinated. But ask yourself, does that timeline make sense? In a world where fully modern humans, anatomically similar to us, have existed for tens of thousands of years, how likely is it that they spent almost all that time doing nothing of consequence, then suddenly, everywhere at once, began to build monumental architecture and complex societies just in the last few ticks of the clock? Official history shrugs. That's just how it happened. Yet when we overlay the myths of an ancient northern homeland, the persistent cartographic traces of a structured Arctic, and the sudden, almost explosive appearance of complex societies at lower latitudes, another possibility emerges. Not a slow upwards crawl from nothing, but a reset. A former center removed, survivors displaced, knowledge fragmented. We are told that no such civilization could have existed in the Arctic because the climate wouldn't allow it. Too cold, too harsh, too hostile. But climate is not static. Ice ages come and go. Axial tilt can shift. Ocean currents can reroute entire weather systems. We accept dramatic climatic changes when they serve a safe, abstract narrative about deep time. Yet we refuse to consider that such changes could have affected human civilization directly, catastrophically, and recently enough for memory to survive. Even when those memories sit right in front of us, coded as stories of a mild northern realm where the sun behaves strangely and people live far longer than we do, even when they are repeated in culture after culture, continent after continent. This is where the attack on the official narrative becomes unavoidable. We are told, the Arctic was always essentially as it is now. Ice, water, scattered islands, no great lost lands at the pole. The myths of a northern homeland are symbolic, not descriptive. The early maps that show a structured Arctic are mistakes and myths. The lost book Inventio Fortunata is not worth worrying about. These things happen. The disappearance of Mercator's polar model is just science correcting error. Each of these statements relies on you not looking too closely. Because once you bring in simple logic and basic counting, they fall apart. What are the odds that ancient writers made up a northern land with yearly sunrise and sunset, and accidentally described the exact behavior of the sun in polar regions? Medieval chroniclers imagined a northern gulf that pulls in the seas, and later cartographers imagined a polar whirlpool that does the same thing. And a lost travelogue imagined a central current draining into the earth, all without any connection to real, observed phenomena? Multiple mapmakers across different countries and decades coincidentally drew the same fourfold arrangement of land and sea at the pole, with consistent sizes and shapes and even a shared name for the central rock. A strategic region with massive economic importance just happened to be mapped in detail based on pure fantasy, and no one in power ever questioned the reliability of that fantasy until, conveniently, those maps were no longer needed. The probability of each of these being independent, harmless mistakes is low. The probability of them all stacking together, pointing to the same missing picture, is microscopic. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern, and patterns demand explanation. So, what is the alternative? Here is the radical possibility that official history refuses to entertain. At some point in the not-so-distant past, the top of our world was home to a highly advanced, long-lived civilization situated in a unique climatic and magnetic environment, a civilization remembered as Hyperborea. Encoded into myths as a homeland of gods, and fossilized in old maps as 4 great islands surrounding a central magnetic mountain, this civilization did not vanish quietly. Something happened. Whether through natural catastrophe, cosmic event, or human-induced disaster, the polar region underwent a violent transformation. Climate shifted, seas rearranged, the central lands fractured, submerged, or were encased in ice. The Great Magnetic Formation, whatever its exact nature, was disrupted or buried. The survivors scattered across the lower latitudes carried fragments of knowledge and memory. Those fragments became the Greek stories of a land beyond the north wind, the Norse tales of a world tree reaching up from the north, the Hindu Mount Meru at the center of the world, countless myths of gods or ancestors who came from a bright, cold land at the top of the world, then disappeared. Over time, the memories blurred, the survivors blended with local populations. Their descendants sometimes rose as elites, priestly castes, or mysterious founders of new civilizations. The technical data degraded into ritual and symbol, but not everyone forgot. A hidden chain, monastic, royal, or something else, preserved more precise information. Long after Hyperborea itself was gone, a 14th century friar could still travel north under royal commission, equipped as a mathematician, and recognize remnants of the old structure, anomalous currents, strange magnetism, perhaps even the silhouette of a ruin or mountain at the center of swirling seas. He writes Inventio Fortunata. That book feeds into Kanoyan's Itinerarium. Mercator reads it, along with others. He knows enough to assign coordinates, distances, and geometry. He knows the Arctic is not an empty unknown. It is a graveyard. And then, in the centuries that follow, the decision is made, not just to move on from the old model, but to destroy it. Maps are revised. Old plates are replaced. Obsolete images are locked away in collections. A new generation of explorers is raised to believe the pole was always ice, always blank, always marginal. By the time the first successful expeditions to the geographic pole happen in the modern era, under conditions of heavy national propaganda and military interest, the narrative is already set. They are not allowed to see what was once there, and neither are we. We are told that satellites, aircraft, and submarines have fully mapped the Arctic, that there are no missing lands, no polar whirlpools, no towering magnetic mountains. We are not shown the full raw data. We are shown curated images, selected bathymetric charts, sanitized models. We are not invited to compare those modern representations with Mercator's Arctic Circle and ask why his configuration resembles, eerily, certain known bathymetric features hidden beneath the ice and sea. We are not encouraged to ask why certain polar regions have been restricted, militarized, or explained away with vague references to hazardous conditions and no-fly zones. We are told to look away. The official narrative does not merely have gaps. It collapses under its own contradictions. If the North was always empty, why did so many people insist it was structured? If the old maps were pure fantasy, why are they so consistent and so carefully measured? If the myths were just symbolic, why do they align with the astronomical and climatic peculiarities of the Arctic? If nothing of consequence ever existed there, why was it necessary to erase and replace the entire earlier image of the pole? And above all, if our current understanding is complete, why does any of this make you feel like something is deeply, viscerally wrong? We stand at a strange crossroads. On one side, the comfortable story, a slowly discovered planet, a blank Arctic filled in step by step, no resets, no erased chapters. Everything important happened where we're told it did, when we're told it did. On the other side, a more disturbing possibility that we are living in the aftermath of a massive, deliberate simplification, a flattening of the past in which an entire polar civilization has been reduced to myth, its surviving symbols scattered across cultures like broken glass. If that second possibility is true, or even partially true, then the implications are enormous. It would mean that our current civilization is not the first, but at least the second major cycle on this planet. It would mean that we are misreading our own myths as fantasy, when they may, in fact, be degraded engineering reports and astronomical observations from a previous age. It would mean that our maps are not neutral descriptions of reality, but political instruments used to hide certain structures and emphasize others. It would mean that even now, powerful interests might be operating with a deeper knowledge of Earth's true history than the one given to the rest of us. And it would mean that every time you see the top of the world drawn as a smooth white cap, you are looking at an edited image, an absence that has been designed. So we come back to that simple, unsettling picture. 4 lands, 4 seas, a central whirlpool, and a black magnetic mountain rising at the pole. Is it literal, symbolic, a hybrid of both? We don't know. But we know this: it is not random. It is not meaningless. It is not an innocent mistake repeated by accident for centuries, only to vanish conveniently when centralizing powers needed the Arctic to be an empty frontier instead of a buried origin, somewhere between the ancient myths, the medieval Gulf, the Lost Friar's travelogue, and Mercator's forbidden map. A different story of the North Pole emerges, a story of memory, catastrophe, erasure, and control. And if that story is even partially true, then the question we should be asking is no longer, Why did old maps show a black rock at the pole? The real question is, what else have they erased that we still haven't noticed? Because if an entire former center of civilization can be reduced to decorative myth and antique curiosities, what does that say about the security of any truth in our timeline? What does it say about our own future? In the end, we are left with a chilling possibility that we are walking on the ruins of a world we were never meant to remember, guided by maps designed not to reveal, but to conceal. The North may no longer look like Mercator drew it, but the shadows of those four lands, that whirlpool, that impossible mountain, are still there, hiding beneath ice, ocean, and narrative. And the moment you see that shadow, you can never unsee it. So we have to ask ourselves, quietly, honestly, if this is only one suppressed chapter, how many more are there? The investigation is only beginning.